He stood in front of a room full of people and bet a piece of his own company that I would walk into our reunion broke, embarrassed, and forgotten. He wanted one final laugh at my expense. But he had no idea that the girl he used to mock now owned a $60 million private jet. And what happened that night would humble him in front of everyone he ever tried to impress. Before I go any further, I need you to promise me something. Stay until the end, because this story has a twist that even I didn't see coming until it happened right in front of me. If stories like this move you, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's get into what really happened that night, because trust me, you have never heard a comeback like this one. My name is Simone, and to understand how I ended up stepping off a private jet in front of the same people who once laughed at my old shoes, you have to go back to where it all began. Because nothing about my story started with money. It started with loss, with silence, with a little girl who had every reason to believe she would never amount to anything. I grew up in a small town called Millhaven, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you even had a chance to explain it yourself. If your family struggled financially, the whole town knew it, and somehow they never let you forget it either. We weren't the kind of poor people talk about in dramatic stories. We were the quiet kind of poor. The kind where you learn to stretch one loaf of bread across an entire week. The kind where you smile through an empty stomach because admitting the truth feels heavier than hiding it. I was 12 years old the day my entire world changed. My father had a heart condition nobody caught in time, and one ordinary morning he simply didn't wake up. I remember standing frozen in the hallway of our small house, watching my mother collapse onto the kitchen floor, her cries echoing through walls that suddenly felt too thin to hold in that much pain. After that day, nothing about my childhood stayed the same. My mother took on more shifts cleaning offices at night just to keep our lights on. I became the one raising my younger brother and sister, waking before sunrise to get them ready for school, making sure they ate even on nights I went to bed hungry myself. By the time I reached high school, I was already carrying weight most adults never have to carry. And in a school full of teenagers who valued appearance over character, that made me an easy target. There was a boy in my grade named Preston. His family practically owned half the businesses in Millhaven, and everyone treated him like royalty because of it. Preston had a gift for making people feel small, and for reasons I never understood, he decided early on that I would be his favorite target. It started with quiet comments meant to sound like jokes but landed like knives. It grew into him laughing at my worn-out shoes in front of the entire hallway. It escalated into humiliating moments I still remember more clearly than I wish I did. One afternoon in a cafeteria full of students, Preston knocked my lunch tray straight out of my hands. Food spilled across the floor, across my clothes, and instead of apologizing, he stood there laughing with his friends like it was the greatest entertainment of his day. Nobody helped me clean it up. I knelt down alone while dozens of eyes watched in silence, and in that moment I wished the floor would simply swallow me whole. But nothing compares to the night of our school's big formal event, the one evening every student looked forward to all year. I had saved every spare dollar for weeks hoping to buy a simple dress so I could finally feel normal for one night. But 2 days before the event, our refrigerator broke down, and my mother needed every cent I had saved to fix it so our food wouldn't spoil. Without hesitation, I gave her the money because that's what you do for family. But that night, sitting home in old pajamas while pictures of my classmates in beautiful outfits filled my social media feed, something inside me broke quietly. I cried into my pillow so my younger siblings wouldn't hear me, telling myself it didn't matter, even though it felt like the whole world was reminding me of everything I didn't have. Preston made sure I never forgot that night either. The following week, in front of a group of classmates, he asked loudly why I hadn't shown up, already knowing the painful truth. When I stayed silent, he laughed and said some people simply weren't made for nice things. I remember walking away from him that day, saying nothing, because what do you say to someone who has never once gone without anything in his entire life? But deep inside, I made myself a silent promise. One day, things would be different. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when, but I knew that promise would carry me somewhere far beyond Millhaven. After graduation, I left my hometown and never looked back. I moved to a bigger city with barely enough money to cover a single month's rent, working 2 jobs while attending community college at night. There were nights I slept in my car because I couldn't afford both tuition and rent in the same month. There were days I survived on nothing but crackers until my next paycheck arrived, but something inside me refused to break. I studied business and finance because I wanted to understand exactly how wealth was built, how systems worked, and how I could create something nobody could ever take from me again. I started small, working at a logistics company, learning every detail about supply chains and transportation most people overlooked. I asked questions nobody else bothered asking. I stayed late studying operations long after my shifts ended. Slowly, I began noticing gaps in the industry, inefficiencies costing companies millions simply because nobody had built a smarter system. So, using every ounce of knowledge I gathered, I began building one myself. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't instant. It took years of rejected pitches, denied loan applications, and doors slammed shut simply because certain people looked at me and decided I didn't fit whatever picture they imagined of someone deserving success. But I refused to quit. Eventually, one investor took a chance, not fully believing in me yet, but believing enough in the idea. That single opportunity was all I needed. I built a logistics and transportation company from nothing, solving problems larger corporations had ignored for years. Slowly, it grew. Then, faster than I ever imagined possible, contracts came in, then bigger contracts followed. International partnerships followed after that. By the time I turned 30, my company operated across multiple countries, moving goods for some of the biggest names in retail and manufacturing. The girl who once cried over a dress she couldn't afford had built an empire worth tens of millions of dollars. Somewhere during all that growth, I lost touch with almost everyone from Millhaven. Life pulled me in a different direction, and honestly, there wasn't much from that town I wanted to hold on to. Every now and then, small updates would reach me through old classmates online, little pieces of who got married, who moved away, who never left at all. I heard Preston eventually took over his family's businesses after his father stepped back. I heard he still walked around Millhaven like he owned it, still carrying that same arrogance he wore back in high school. None of it surprised me. For years, nobody in that town had any real idea what had become of me. I never posted my success online. I never flaunted anything. I built quietly because true power rarely needs an announcement. So when whispers began circulating about our upcoming 10-year reunion, most people in Millhaven assumed I was still exactly where I left off, invisible, struggling, forgotten. That assumption is exactly what set everything into motion. A few months before the reunion, an old classmate reached out, letting me know the event was happening and that people were curious whether I would attend. At first, I wasn't interested. Why would I want to return to a place that only reminded me of pain? But something inside me shifted. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was closure, maybe some quiet part of me wanted to see how far I had truly come, standing again in the same halls that once tried convincing me I would never become anything. But here's where things took a turn I never expected. According to people who told me afterward, Preston had heard rumors that I might actually show up, and true to who he had always been, he couldn't resist turning it into entertainment for his friends. At a gathering weeks before the reunion, Preston laughed and told everyone there was no possible way I could have built any kind of real success, considering where I came from. Someone challenged him, half joking, asking what he was even willing to risk on something he seemed so certain about. Preston, full of his usual pride, said he was so confident that he'd stake a share of his own company on it. He told his friends if I somehow showed up looking successful, he'd hand over part of his business, because in his mind there was absolutely no chance that could ever happen. His friends laughed, certain it was the easiest bet they'd ever make, and they began planning jokes and comments to embarrass me the moment I walked through those doors. When I first heard about this bet, that old familiar sting from high school tried creeping back in. But this time it didn't hurt the way it used to. This time it made me calm, almost amused, because I realized Preston hadn't changed one bit. He was still the same boy finding his worth by trying to diminish someone else's. I made my decision right then. I was going to that reunion, and I was going to let him see exactly who he had bet against. The weeks leading up to that night felt like preparing for something far bigger than a simple class reunion. I wasn't preparing an outfit or a hairstyle. I was preparing my mindset. I thought about that 15-year-old girl who once cried at home because she couldn't afford a dress. I thought about every lunch tray knocked to the floor, every whispered joke, every moment I felt smaller than I truly was. And I decided that when I walked back into Millhaven, I wasn't walking in as the girl who left. I was walking in as the woman I had built myself into, piece by piece, sacrifice by sacrifice. The night of the reunion finally arrived, and back in Millhaven, the entire venue buzzed with anticipation. People were catching up, taking photos, laughing about old memories. Preston walked through that room like he still owned it, greeting old classmates loudly, occasionally glancing toward the entrance every time the door opened. His friends kept nudging him, whispering jokes about what they'd say the moment I finally arrived, if I arrived at all. Some people started wondering out loud whether I would even show up. According to those who were there, every time headlights passed outside, the entire room paused for just a second before continuing. Meanwhile, I was already on my way, though not the way I once left that town years earlier in an old car barely running on fumes. This time I flew in on my own private jet, a jet that represented every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every rejected loan application, every moment I refused to give up on myself. As we descended toward the small local airport outside Millhaven, I looked out the window at familiar hills and rooftops, the same view I used to see from my childhood bedroom, except now from a completely different altitude, both literally and in life. When I landed, a car waited to take me straight to the venue. Sitting in the back seat, I took a slow breath, feeling that same nervous energy I used to feel walking into that school every single day. Except this time, it wasn't fear rising inside me. It was anticipation. I arrived later than most people that night, and I found out afterward that my delayed arrival only intensified the suspense already building inside that room. When my car pulled up outside the venue, a few people near the windows noticed immediately and began whispering. By the time I stepped out, dressed in a way that reflected everything I had built, elegant, powerful, undeniable, a small crowd had already gathered near the entrance just to see who was arriving. I heard someone whisper my name, followed by a wave of surprised murmurs spreading through the room like wildfire. I walked through those doors and the entire room shifted instantly. Conversations quieted, heads turned. I felt dozens of eyes locking onto me, the same eyes that once looked at me with pity or mockery, now looking at me with something entirely different. I scanned the room and found Preston standing near the center, mid-laugh with his friends, until the sudden silence around him made him turn to see exactly what everyone else was already staring at. Our eyes met, and I watched his expression change in real time. That smug confidence he walked in with started slipping the very second he realized exactly who was standing in front of him. I didn't rush toward anyone. I didn't need validation from a room that once made me feel invisible. I walked calmly, greeting a few old classmates who approached with genuine warmth, people who had actually been kind to me years ago and deserved kindness in return. But I could feel Preston watching me from across the room, clearly struggling to process what he was witnessing. Eventually, he approached me, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He asked how I had been, his voice noticeably different from the arrogant tone I remembered from years before. I told him simply that I had spent my years building something meaningful. He asked what kind of work I did, and I explained my company, the international contracts, the entire industry I had transformed over the years. I watched the color slowly drain from his face as reality started sinking in. Someone in the group mentioned, half joking, half serious, that Preston had actually staked a piece of his own company on how I'd show up that night. I saw him tense immediately, shooting a sharp glance toward whoever brought it up. I could have exploded with anger in that moment. I could have humiliated him publicly the same way he once humiliated me for years. But instead, I looked at him calmly and said something that carried far more weight than any angry outburst ever could. I told him it was interesting how some people spend their entire lives betting against someone else's success instead of building their own. I told him I hoped whatever he wagered was worth the lesson he just learned. Then I smiled, genuinely, not out of spite but out of peace, and walked away to enjoy the rest of my evening. The remainder of that night felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Word about the bet spread quickly through the room, and people who once laughed alongside Preston now looked at him completely differently. Classmates who barely acknowledged me back in high school suddenly wanted to reconnect, asking about my company, asking for advice, asking if I was hiring. I recognized that shift for exactly what it was. It wasn't genuine connection, it was simple proximity to success. But I handled it all with grace because I had already gotten everything I needed from that night. I didn't need their admiration. I didn't need Preston's humiliation to feel complete. I already felt complete the moment I stepped off that private jet because that jet was never truly about luxury. It was proof of everything I had overcome to get there. Later that evening, as I stood near the entrance preparing to leave, I ran into Preston one final time. He looked at me without a trace of the arrogance he once carried so proudly, and he apologized quietly, sincerely, admitting he had been cruel toward me for reasons even he couldn't fully explain, other than his own insecurity hiding behind false confidence. I accepted his apology, not because he necessarily deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved the peace that came with finally releasing that old pain. Holding on to anger toward him would have only kept me tied to a version of myself I had already outgrown. Driving away from that reunion, watching Millhaven shrink behind me one final time, I thought about that 15-year-old girl crying quietly because she couldn't afford a simple dress. I thought about every moment I felt invisible, every moment someone tried convincing me my circumstances defined my worth. And I realized something powerful in that moment. Every hardship I endured wasn't a setback, it was preparation. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every meal I skipped so my siblings could eat, every rejected loan application, every door slammed shut in my face, all of it built the foundation for the life I eventually created. Real success isn't about proving people wrong, even though sometimes it feels satisfying when it happens naturally. Real success is about proving to yourself that you're capable of far more than your circumstances ever suggested. It's about becoming so secure in who you are that other people's opinions simply lose their power over you completely. Preston's bet, his cruelty, his years of mockery, none of that ever defined me. It only revealed who he truly was. My response that night, the calm, the grace, the refusal to seek revenge, that's what defined me instead. If there's one thing I want you to carry from my story, it's this. Whatever you're facing right now, whatever struggle feels impossible today, whatever people are predicting about your future based on your current circumstances, none of that has the final say over your life. You have the final say. Keep building quietly even when nobody's watching. Because one day, the very people who once doubted you will watch you rise higher than they ever imagined possible, and you won't even need to say a single word. Your life will speak for itself. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or completely counted out by people who should have believed in you, drop a comment right now and tell me about a time someone doubted you and how you proved them wrong. Let's build a community of people who understand that circumstances never determine destiny. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next story. Hit that like button if you made it this far, and share this with someone who needs to hear this today. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the very next one.